Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how white capitalist countries recover very quickly from economic devastation. Former white but former communist countries recover, much more slowly, and black countries go into reverse. So black-run countries, especially if they take over from white administrations, they achieve almost the impossible feat, I would think, of inheriting a sophisticated first world economy, that's a country that's rich and successful by any measure. And within a decade or two, the black administration or black government can turn that bountiful land of plenty into an economic basket case hellscape. And you think, well, that's impossible to do, but we've got so many examples of this now. Pretty much every nation in Africa when the black administrations took over in the 1950s, they inherited, very wealthy, Rhodesia or Zimbabwe and so on. They inherited, very wealthy economies and first world educated leaders and so on, and yet they still turned into basket cases, impoverished basket cases. And you think, well, that's not even possible. I mean, how could you do that? But there you go. Now the white countries are in reverse. So just as sort of to try and get a beginning position here and some perspective, say at the end of World War II, where there'd been very substantial devastation, and if not absolute devastation in terms of, the acres or miles and miles of factories and industrial areas ruined through bombing and various military activities, tanks rolling through the place and so on. Just aside from that, we're talking economic dislocation on a grand scale. The economic dislocation of Europe was other than Britain, was huge. The GDP of Germany sort of in 1946 was close to zero. Yet by 1959, West Germany, as it then was divided from the East Germany, which was communist control. West Germany was already had a GDP that was surpassing that of Britain. So within 12 to 13 years, the German economy had recovered, and it was really had the shit kicked out of it. The German economy was already playing in the first league of nations there. Similar, in France, the French economy was dislocated, and it took longer to recover even than the German economy. Austria recovered, and so on. So you look at all within 20 years, every one of those devastated economies was in the first group of the wealthiest economies in the world. Within 20 years, they'd gone from seriously screwed up economies to being not in the middle or not somewhere doing better or a bit of improvement, but in the first league of the richest nations. Now, how did they do that? It was their organisation, their economic organisation. It was the skill and capability of their governments. Sure, there was American loans, but those loans were also available to other places that frittered them away. So there were very sensible commercial and business decisions were being made. There was a careful review, and not that there weren't mistakes, they were, but the careful review of what they were going to, straight after the war, the Danes went in for large scale. Well, firstly, it was agriculture. So I don't know if you lived in Europe, during that time, you probably heard of what was Danish bacon, which was considered to be the premier bacon, and so Danish bacon, and so I remember traveling through Europe with the folks as a kid, and I remember distinctly the this is like a breakfast in a hotel, and the waiter saying, "What's it? Danish bacon?" As if that, oh, that'll clinch it. That'll clinch it. But also there was, the French also went into agriculture, so they were, Frenchmen in berets cycling around England, selling their onions, that were strung across the handlebar. That's probably a bit of a, that's taken on almost mythical proportions, but it did happen. So the recovery was actually fairly swift. Now let's say so again within 20 years, and in probably the majority of cases within 12 years, 12 to 14 years, the recovery was pretty much complete. And now you've got to admire that sort of achievement. That it's the ingenuity of the people, that their ability to organise, the infrastructure, the focus on achieving that level of prosperity, and the ability to make far fewer bad decisions than good ones, and to minimise wastage and then achieve the outcome that they did. You can't look at it in any way and not be impressed. Now let's look at say Eastern Europe following the fall of the Soviet Communist Empire. Now this all occurred sort of between 1989 and say 1993, 1992. Say that 3 years was the critical time, and so these economies have been free, able to pursue capitalist policies for 30 years now. Yet their GDP per capita, in spite of all the help, all the propping up they've got, the millions of them that have gone to other first world economies, such as Britain and so on, to find work, and then sending money back to their relatives in fucking Poland or wherever. In spite of all that, their GDP is less than half, in some cases substantially less than half the average GDP of the West European nations. Now, after 30 years, you'd think they'd be catching up pretty much, but they're not. They're still lagging far behind. And if you actually pick apart the inflation, their GDP numbers, their overall GDP, a lot of that has come from artificial asset inflation of West Europeans coming in and buying up real estate, for example. So if you actually look at the productive element, producing more, higher value, this sort of thing, then there's not really a whole lot of that. And if the people in France and the people in Denmark or the people in Germany, they weren't leaving. I mean, some were, but they weren't leaving. They were staying there to rebuild their own countries. Whereas as soon as the East European Iron Curtain, as they call it, the divide between East and West Europe, or between capitalist and communist Europe, as soon as that Iron Curtain came down, anybody who could was going to the West. As soon as they were given common market membership, anyone they were desperately trying to get the fuck out of the place and go to places like Britain and so on. So there's a very high proportion of the most talented people just couldn't wait to leave. They didn't want to stay in their country and build that up and try and make their country successful. So when we look at the three things here, why is it that the white Western capitalist economies were able to recover so quickly? Not that they were able to recover, I think that was inevitable, but so quickly. Sure, there was loans and everything, but aside from that, they all recovered very quickly from, in the overall scheme of things, they recovered very quickly from that dislocation. If it wasn't for the political fracas in France, where the old Third Republic, that's the pre-1940 French government, the old Third Republic politicians coming back and squabbling and trying to fuck each other up, and the Communist Party trying to play a bigger role than they really should have. Other than that, France recovered quite quickly as well. And again, the Austria and Denmark and Norway and even Italy did quite well really in recovery, particularly the northern part of Italy did quite well in recovering. Holland recovered very quickly, and Belgium too recovered quickly. So the recovery rates were just very swift. Now in East Europe, the recovery rates are very slow. I think it'll take, in order to achieve parity with the West, I think it'll take another 25 to 30 years for Eastern Europe to achieve that level of parity with the capitalist Western Europe. That'll make the transition, to the recovery, if you will, of 70 years. Now, some have pointed to the the Czech Republic as an example. Prague being the capital there. Some are saying, well, look, their economy is now 5 times bigger than it was in when they threw off the communist regime. So it's 5 times bigger, or Hungary, it's 5 times bigger. And this shows just how successful it's been. Well, yeah, but the base was so low. The base was almost at zero. So to say it's 5 times better than it was when the base was so low to begin with, the economic base was so low to begin with, then 5 times isn't particularly impressive. Particularly when you look at they'd still need to grow by 20 times in order to achieve parity with the West. And they're still a long way from that. Even if you look at the most productive East European former communist nations, the most productive ones, such as the Czech Republic, such as Poland, Hungary, those, if you look at those, or maybe not so much the Baltic states, but even if you look at the most impressive ones, they're still far behind the capitalist West. And if you look at those in the tail of, say, Romania and Bulgaria and those sort of places, then I don't know if they'll ever catch up. If they do, it'll be only because the West declines sharply. That'll be the only way these guys will catch up. Assuming the West doesn't decline sharply or substantially, then it'll take these guys, if they ever achieve it, it'll take them well over 100 years. So that's how backward these economies were to begin with, but equally how unable they are to achieve what the Western Europeans achieved, the Germans and the French, Danes and so on, when they recovered from World War II, from their devastated economies. If anything, the East European economies were in a better position in terms of the platform from which they would do the initial liftoff. But what I don't, they haven't achieved anywhere near what the West, the Danes, and again the Germans, they were first world economies again within 15 years. Why when they've had twice as long, why are these East European economies still struggling? Is it the legacy of communism? Because they were only communist for, well, I say only, still a while. They're only communist for sort of 50 years. So it wasn't like they've known nothing but communism. But anyway, that's it. Now coming back to Africa, because there are other factors involved here. When South Africa was one of the richest countries in the world, it had a population of about 17 million. And most of those were black people who'd come from other black countries in Africa. They weren't the native black people, far from it. And so you had something in the order of, I think it was roughly 3 million 3 million white people, and then 13 or 14 million black people back in the time. And the more prosperous South Africa got, the more black people wanted to come there. And the white government didn't stop it when they should have. The white government didn't stop it because there was the cheap labour coming in. And then when they got too many, there were too many of them coming in, they corralled them off into separate provinces, if you will. And this was a further extension of what became known as the apartheid regime. Now, if you look at the population of South Africa today, since the 1970s, for example, the population has increased by, wait for this, 320%. So in 50 years, the population of South Africa has increased by 320%. Now, if you look at any white person who can get the fuck out of South Africa is getting out. So over 1 million white people, probably closer to 2 million now, white people have left South Africa, and over that 50 years, and certainly curtailed procreation. And so that same time, then the black population has increased from about 13.5 million to 50 million. So we're looking at the black population has increased over that 50 years by 350 odd fucking percent. That's the increase in the black population of South Africa in that time. Now, if you deduct from South Africa the artificial inflation from property prices and those sorts of things, if you deduct that from the South African economic statistics, which I don't think are representative at all of what the real state of the economy there, but if you deduct that from there, that means the per capita wealth of South Africa has declined in purchasing power terms fivefold. So every black citizen, other than the elites who are robbing, corrupt and robbing the place prime, every black citizen in South Africa is now worse off economically than they were when the whites were in charge. So the black governments have managed to turn South Africa and Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, and other Kenya. I mean, the list goes on, and has turned them from viable, rich, go-ahead sort of places that have got a promising and bright future, have turned them into shithole basket cases, hellscapes, economic hellscapes, where crime and so on is off the charts. And if you look at the amount of robberies and muggings and rapes in South Africa when the whites were in charge, it was almost nothing. You look at it today, and it's just insane. So people's quality of life, standard of living, whether you're looking at from an economic point of view or that your chances of getting mugged and raped and murdered, all these sorts of things. So why is it that the black countries have uniquely managed to go backwards economically, while white country has been economically devastated, can become from devastation to first world status within 15 years? A black economy that's in the first world position in terms of wealth per capita is able to turn itself into one of the poorest countries in the world also within 15 years. There's a message in this somewhere. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.